You quickly held up a molecule there. Talk more about that.
So this molecule is a trichloroethylene, so little high school chemistry, hopefully no flashbacks for people. So water is made up of three atoms, H2O, two hydrogens and one oxygen. Trichloroethylene is made up of six atoms, two carbons in black, one hydrogen in white, and three chlorines in blue, hence its name, trichloroethylene. It's got a cousin called perchloroethylene, and unfortunately, almost all of us have been exposed to these chemicals, and almost all of us know nothing about it. I didn't know much, if anything, about these chemicals until about 10 years ago. These chemicals are associated with a 500% increased risk of developing Parkinson's, according to a small twin study. Um, in the lab, these chemicals reproduce the features of Parkinson's disease. Certainly, trichloroethylene does. These chemicals, trichloroethylene is known to cause cancer. Among the cancers linked to it are kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, multiple myeloma, leukemia in children, prostate cancer, brain cancer, and perchloroethylene likely causes cancer. And a lot of us have been exposed to it. In 1970, there were 10 million pounds, no, 2 pounds of trichloroethylene per American, 500 million pounds of the chemical used. Estimated 10 million people worked with it, and everything from printers and painters, varnish workers, dry cleaners, mechanics, varnish workers, all worked with it. Then it's widely contaminated the military bases throughout the United States. Half of the most toxic sites in the country, called Superfund sites, are contaminated with it. And people were exposed to it in consumer products, everything from carpet cleaners to gun cleaners, typewriter correction fluid, and even in decaffeinated coffee in the 1970s. In our book, we detail how people were exposed to these chemicals in their water and the indoor air, because these chemicals can readily evaporate. And I think this might be one of the most important causes of Parkinson's in the U.S.
Somebody now aware of these two chemicals, how do they test or assess their environment to see if they're being exposed?
There are things that you can do to just reduce your exposure at the outset. So you can get a green dry cleaner, a dry cleaner that does not use perchloroethylene, often called perc in the industry. You can put a water filter or a carbon filter. You can get it at the grocery store to decrease the exposure to these chemicals in your water. If you live near a contaminated site, you can test your indoor air. There are companies, one's called Simple Lab. I have no affiliation with them, where you can get your indoor air tested for these chemicals. You can test your water for these chemicals. You can either do that through your municipality or also through this company and others that can test your water for these chemicals. Turns out that 40 million Americans, 1 in 8 Americans, get their water from wells. And wells aren't regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act and are infrequently tested, usually only when you buy or sell your home. And when they're tested, they're generally tested for bacteria, which is important so you don't get diarrhea, but they're generally not tested for pesticides, which might be really important in rural areas. And they're not tested for chemicals like trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene routinely, which might be really important if you're in suburban or urban areas.
You quickly mentioned Superfund sites there, and these are sites in the US that are affected by the PCE or TCE. People can go online, see how close they are. And the way I understand it, the people responsible for the contamination are being held responsible and they need to clean it up.
Yeah. And so, like, the Superfund sites came into the public awareness in the 1970s. Love Canal, not too far from where I used to live in Rochester, New York, was contaminated with trichloroethylene and other chemicals that a chemical firm had largely dumped into a canal that was in a development that was supposed to be like the suburban area of the future. Unfortunately, wasn't the future wasn't good for many individuals, because the chemicals started coming up from their soil, coming into their basement, and it actually led to evacuation of some neighborhoods in the 1970s, led President Carter and others to create a Superfund Act that designated these sites for federal cleanup and to try to hold the wrongdoers accountable for them. There's about 1,200 of these sites throughout the country. There's 15 of them on a 7-mile stretch of the 101 freeway in Silicon Valley, because this chemical was used to clean off silicon wafers there. Over half these sites are contaminated with trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene. And lest you think this is somebody else's problem, it turns out that 20 million Americans live within a mile of one of these sites. 70 million, I think, live within 3 miles. And in addition to these 1,200 or so Superfund sites, there are thousands of other contaminated sites. Where I lived in suburban Rochester, where all the doctors and lawyers lived, I, I was within 5 to 10 minutes of four sites that were contaminated with either trichloroethylene or perchloroethylene, including three dry cleaners. I'm here in New York City living, and, Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn is contaminated with these chemicals, and they found these chemicals in the indoor air of residences in Brooklyn. So this problem is all around us, but almost no one's paying attention to it, and we're all paying a really, really, really high cost for this in terms of cancer and likely Parkinson's disease.
You mentioned there quickly that people aren't paying attention. How many people living nearby one of these sites do you think are aware of it?
I think very few. I'll give you an example. So, here I am, a neurologist, been writing about this, and I said to myself, where's the last place in the world that I'm going to find trifluoroethylene? And I went to high school in Newport Beach, California, and I said, Newport Beach, California, last place in the world to find trichloroethylene. So I did a very sophisticated research study. I typed in trichloroethylene and Newport Beach into Google, and I hit return. And it turned out that within a quarter mile of where I went to high school, at Cronin High School, there was a former aerospace facility that had been contaminated with these chemicals. And there were multi-million-dollar homes hundreds of yards away from where I went to high school in Newport Beach, California, that were sitting on top of soil that was contaminated with these chemicals. And these chemicals had been found in the indoor air in people's master bedrooms, in their living rooms, and in kids' playrooms. And I think most people, even today, many of the people who live in this community in Newport Beach, about 3 miles from Pacific Ocean, are unaware of these contamination.
Okay, so you mentioned there's a ton of these throughout the US. How long does it take to clean them up? And how many of them are being actively cleaned? And how many of them are just marked off for people to know?
It's hard to clean them up. I'm a neurologist, not a toxicologist, not an environmental scientist, but it's pretty easy to prevent people from getting exposed. So, water filters can help. Changing your municipalities can change their water sources if that's the issue. In many cases, the water that people are getting is not coming from underneath their homes, so it's sometimes not an issue. The other issue is this. It's called vapor intrusion. These chemicals evaporate like radon. Many people know that radon can be found in your soil and can enter your basement, and it can cause lung cancer. So you test for it. And if your radon in your basement, it's not a terrible big deal because you can put a remediation system in that basically sucks the air from underneath your foundation and vents the radon above your roof, preventing the radon from entering your home. The same thing can be done for people who live on top of these plumes of trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene. You can test your indoor air. If it's elevated, you can put this basically a radon remediation system that sucks the air from underneath your foundation, vents it above the roof to prevent exposure to it. Cleanup is hard and it's long and it's all I'll just say that there are great people and there are great public health experts and environmental scientists working to ensure the health and well-being of us and our communities. But I would also say that there are strong financial incentives to underplay, downplay, hide, not draw attention to these contaminations when they are found or known. And that cleanup takes years, decades, and oftentimes is hidden, risks are downplayed almost all the time. I get communications almost every week from someone in Maryland, someone in Arizona, who I think might have got their Parkinson's disease from exposure to these chemicals in their community. And just these concerns aren't being addressed. If you step back, we should ask, why are Parkinson's getting more common? Why are people under 50 getting more colon cancer? Why are 131 children getting autism? Why are 1 in 3 85-year-olds getting Alzheimer's disease? Diseases have causes, and our job as neurologists, as scientists, as physicians, is to find out those causes so we can prevent people from ever getting these diseases in the first place.
I'm sure a lot of people tuning in today are going to be wondering how close they are to one of these sites. Is there one website people can go to and put in like their zip code and see?
Yeah, so EPA has a site to find this if you live near a Superfund site. So you can find that many state departments of state EPAs, or sometimes called Department of Environmental Conservation, some have maps. We actually provided a map in our book for people who live in Rochester, New York. It's on page 46. And so you can see that in Rochester, New York, we found over 100 contaminated sites with trichloroethylene or perchloroethylene in Rochester, New York, including the 4 that I mentioned were near where I lived. I'm working with a great geographer at the Atria Health and Research Institute, Brittany Krasnowski, and we're trying to create an environmental health score first for Los Angeles, where that anyone in Los Angeles, for example, can put in their home address and be told what the health is of their home, of that community, based on air quality, water quality, proximity to the Superfund sites, proximity to golf courses, proximity to other toxic sites, so people can have a better sense of what the health is of their environment.
Okay, so somebody finds out they're close to one of these sites. Me personally, I'm going to be trying to come up with a game plan to get out of there. Not everybody's going to have that opportunity. I just want to make sure we cover all the bases. Somebody who can't leave, they know they're going to be there long term, but they know their area is affected. It's in the air, it's in the water. You mentioned the system that we can put in for the air in the house, filtering water. If we do those to the best of our ability, does that bring our exposure down to zero? And then is there any other areas we want to make sure we're looking at and rectifying?
Yeah, so zero is a tough one. But I'll tell you a story. Jane Horton lives in Mountain View, California. She lives across the street from a site that was a Superfund site from both Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel. I think those are the companies because they had used companies like them had used a trichloroethylene to clean off silicon wafers. She had her indoor air tested in her home, and it was found to be elevated. And she had this remediation system put into her home that sucks the air from underneath her foundation, vents it above. And she has her home regularly tested for air quality. And she says she has the cleanest air of any home in Mountain View, California. So this is definitely possible, and it's done all the time. We do it for radon. Many of our listeners have had radon remediation systems put into their homes, and they're breathing air that's largely free of radon. So it's certainly doable. In our book, we give at the back of the book for people who do not want to get Parkinson's or those who already have it. On page 237, we give people the Parkinson's 25 actions people can take in their everyday life to reduce their risk of getting exposed to these chemicals linked to Parkinson's. We talk about, checking your well, which is number 8, using a water filter, which is number 9, choosing your home carefully, which is number 12. So we give you very practical things. It's a Reader's Digest version. It'll take you 10 or 15 minutes to read. It's got lots of pictures. So if people aren't book people and they just want to get to the bottom line, what can they do to reduce their risk of Parkinson's? Or if they already have Parkinson's, they're among the 1.2 million Americans with the disease. What can they do to possibly slow it? We give you 25 recommendations in the back of the book. And then we give you references and resources to investigate further.
Okay, when an area is deemed a Superfund site, is that just related to the TCE and PCE, or is other chemicals under that umbrella?
It can be others, so like hexachromium from who is the woman who did the Erin Brockovich. So there are other chemicals that can also be responsible for the contamination in Superfund sites. They're not all trichloroethylene or perchloroethylene, but over half are. So if we want to create a world where cancer is being prevented instead of just being treated, if we want to create a world where Parkinson's is being prevented instead of just treated, if we want to create a world where people aren't getting these diseases in the first place so they don't have to spend their time and money at doctors' offices and hospitals, we can prevent these diseases by removing exposure to these chemicals. Just like very relatively few people are have lead poisoning. But, when I was a kid, 95% of American children had unsafe levels of lead in the 1970s. We got rid of leaded paint. We got rid of lead in gasoline. And all of a sudden, lead levels are 95% lower. And children today are 3 to 4 IQ points smarter because we got rid of lead in gasoline. 3 to 4 points smarter because we got rid of lead in gasoline. What happens if we got rid of these degreasing chemicals in dry cleaning or in industrial sites? What happens if we stop spraying weed killers linked to Parkinson's disease on farms? What would happen? We can create a world where these diseases are increasingly rare instead of increasingly common.
Okay, you mentioned well water. So people that are drinking from a well want to have it tested. What about municipal water? Are they testing for these things?
So municipal water should be regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act 1973. I think this is when President Nixon is Richard Nixon's president of the United States, passed the Safe Drinking Water Act, which requires municipalities to test the water that, most of us are drinking. And so they should be tested. Now, it turns out that standards in general have gotten stricter over time. So I say, why wait for the standards to become stricter? Why not get ahead of the curve and reduce your exposure to these chemicals? So when I was in Rochester, New York, I put a carbon filter on my kitchen faucet. And now I have a water tank in New York City, and I fill it up with water that goes through a carbon filter. And then I drink the water from underneath that. When I was in medical school, my wife said we should buy organic, and she'd tell me all these things, and I poo-pooed all the ideas. And I used to think that the food we ate, the water we drank, and the air we breathed was safe. I no longer think that. And so I take actions in my own life, and we give you the actions, basically the actions I take in my own life. Many of them are in the book, 25 actions to reduce your risk to these chemicals in your food, water, and air, so you can live a life that's with a reduced risk of ever getting terrible brain diseases like Parkinson's.
You mentioned military sites. Let's bring those in and talk about what happened there.
Yeah, so I think so many of you know about Camp Lejeune. So Camp Lejeune, for those who don't, it's a Marine base in North Carolina. If you're a Marine, many of you go into training, and you're either trained on the West Coast at Camp Pendleton or on the East Coast at Camp Lejeune. And Marine, especially the officers, need to have their uniforms dry cleaned. They got to look good. And it turned out there was a dry cleaner on right near the base at Camp Lejeune. And the dry cleaning chemicals from that dry cleaning site were inappropriately disposed of or leaked, and they contaminated the drinking water at the Marine base. And there were other sources of contamination, but the water was contaminated from 1953 to 1987. For 25 years, 1 million Marines, their spouses, their children, and civilians were exposed to a cancer-causing chemical in their drinking water, and to a chemical that's associated with a 500% increased risk of developing the disease. For the latter years, the Marine Corps knew about this contamination and did nothing. It took an act of Congress to force the Marine Corps to notify Marines of their exposure so they could take actions to reduce their risk. My colleagues, Drs. Caroline Tanner and Sam Goldman at UC San Francisco, look at the risk of Parkinson's among the Marines who served at Camp Lejeune. Marines, almost by definition, are healthy, almost by definition young. The average age was 20. Some were teenagers. Yet 34 years later, the Marines at Camp Lejeune had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's compared to Marines who served at a less contaminated Camp Pendleton. The seeds of these adult onset brain diseases are planted early, and they're preventable. Parkinson's disease is not a natural consequence of aging. It is an unnatural consequence of aging. You put a mouse in the laboratory and you let it age, it will never spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease, or for that matter, Alzheimer's disease. The only way that mouse develops Parkinson's disease is if you expose it to toxic chemicals like paraquat or trichloroethylene, or manipulate its genes.
You highlighted Camp Lejeune in the dry cleaning. How many military sites were impacted?
In our book, the two protagonists of our book are Dr. Sarah Winningham and Jana Reed. Both were young women when they went to U.S. Air Force Academy, were athletes, ran on the track team. Both became physicians. They served their country around the world, including in Afghanistan. Both became mothers, and both in their 40s were diagnosed with Parkinson's within 1 month of each other. I asked them if they could send me a list of all the bases where they served and when they served, and then I went and saw which were contaminated. I know some people are listening, not watching, but for those who are listening, if you're in the Marines or in the military, you're only at a base for like 1 or 2 years or 3 years, and then you move around. And they gave me a list, each of them, Drs. Jana Reed and Dr. Sarah Winningham, Both had served about 10 different Marine bases around the country. At least half of them we found were contaminated with trichloroethylene. Uh, and we think that trichloroethylene played a role in both of their diseases. Um, this is a really high price for people to pay. People who sign up to serve our country do so knowing that they have a risk of danger and harm from the enemy, but they don't want to be signing up, at least Dr. Whittingham has articulated this far better than I am, to sign up to be exposed to chemicals from the military itself. And we can take action to prevent people like Janet Reed and Sarah Whittingham from developing these terrible diseases, not from combat, not from actions by the enemy, but from actions by the United States. If these chemicals are unsafe to be used in Europe, if some of these weed killers are unsafe to be used in China, we should not be using in the United States. We have great chemists, we have great engineers. We can come up with safer chemicals that allow us to live lives without getting Parkinson's disease, without getting cancer.
For somebody that has been at one of the bases you list there, are there any class action lawsuits to sue? Because you mentioned there, at least with Camp Lejeune, they knew it was happening and didn't disclose.
Yeah, so the Camp Lejeune became on the radar screen because Janie Insminger was a 6-year-old girl at Camp Lejeune when her father, Jerry Insminger, was a Marine drill instructor there. And at age 6, she developed leukemia, and she died at age 9. And her death strained his relationship with his other daughters and really tore apart the family. He ended up divorcing his wife. And then he found out, listening to local news while getting a plate of spaghetti out of the microwave, that a cancer-causing chemical had been found at Camp Lejeune. He then dropped his plate of spaghetti, and then he thought about his daughter, and then he thought about all those who had been, who he had trained. And he had trained them to be Marines, and that you leave no Marine behind. So after 24 years serving our country as a Marine, he's devoted the last 27 plus years and counting to bring justice for those that he trained, for their children, for their daughters, for their sons, and for the civilians who work there. And we now have the Janie Insminger Act that provides benefits to Marines who serve there. And the Camp Lejeune Justice Act, Senator Tom Tillis, among others, helped us get this passed, which allows Marines to sue the federal government for damages as a result of their exposure to these chemicals. So there are lawsuits that are happening. I think when you see these class action lawsuits, you see these because we have failed as a society to protect citizens. We failed to protect Marines. We failed to protect Janie Insminger. We failed to protect Dr. Janet Reed. We failed to protect Dr. Sarah Whittingham. These failures need to end. When these failures end, people like these individuals don't suffer with cancer, don't suffer with Parkinson's disease, and don't die prematurely.
When it comes to TCE and PCE, how much of the problem is from our previous use versus current use? And then where currently are they still being used, given this information you're bringing forth about the problems?
For Parkinson's disease, let me just back up. So if you get diagnosed with lung cancer due to smoking at, say, 60, it's not because you started smoking at 60 or 59 or 58. It's because you're likely smoking when you're a teenager in your 20s. And I think the same is true for Parkinson's disease. Dr. Janet Reed and Sarah Whittingham developed Parkinson's disease in their 40s, not because they worked with the chemical in their 40s, but because they worked with the chemical or were exposed to the chemical in their 20s or thereabout. So I think there's a lag between these exposures and developing the disease, which makes research studies really hard and makes it really hard for people to even associate it. Why would you associate getting Parkinson's disease at age 40 with what you were doing when you were in your 20s? So it's hard to make those associations, but that's one of the challenges that we need to overcome. And then you said other sites.
I wanted to know who's still using these chemicals.
Oh, still using, yeah. So in 2024, the EPA banned both trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene. In 2025, those bans were frozen. The fate of those bans is still uncertain to me. My understanding is that 60% of dry cleaners in the United States still use perchloroethylene. only one state, California, has banned the use of perchloroethylene in dry cleaning. So I tell people to get a green dry cleaner. Dry cleaner does not use perchloroethylene, often called perc in the industry. Use of trichloroethylene has decreased, but I think the latest data that I saw says 250 million pounds still used in the U.S., about 1 pound per American, or at least 1 pound per adult. And two states, New York, where I am, and Minnesota, have banned these chemicals here. These chemicals have largely been banned in Europe, but we're still using them here, even though some companies have advertised safer alternatives.
Given the danger of the Superfund sites, though, even them being banned is the first step, but also if there was contamination in the past, it sounds like that's not naturally cleaning itself up, and it's
Yeah.
actually hard to clean up. Is there a half-life on these chemicals?
Yeah, so there is. I can't give it, but they decayed really, really slowly, and so they remain a problem. There's a plume, a 4 by 2 mile plume in Long Island. Not too far from where I'm sitting here in Manhattan, from a former aerospace facility, and there are hundreds, thousands of people who live about this plume. Um, the EPA administrator is from Long Island. The EPA administrator, this is public information, had leukemia. I wonder, for example, was he exposed to cancer-causing chemicals in Long Island that might have contributed to his cancer? Diseases have causes. Diseases have causes. If you get diagnosed with a disease, one of the first questions you should ask your doctor is, why did I get this disease? Because if you figure that out, one, you're in much better position to treat it, because the cause of disease, the cause of disease might dictate the appropriate treatment. You're positioned to slow your rate of progression and make sure you're stop getting exposed to these chemicals, and you're positioned to prevent your family members from ever getting affected. Diseases have causes. We should find out what these causes are. And there are reasons why 1 in 31 8-year-old children have autism. There are reasons why young women are developing ALS. There are reasons that Parkinson's is one of the world's fastest growing brain diseases. And there are reasons why 1 in 3 85-year-olds are getting Alzheimer's disease in the U.S. And these are not natural. They are unnatural. Brain diseases now are the world's leading source of disability and the leading source of disability in the United States. That has never been the case in human history. It has never been the case in human history that brain diseases are the leading source of disability, and that has now happened. We need to figure out why, so we can change the course of these diseases and prevent people from suffering from these terrible conditions.
I'd have to imagine, if it hasn't already started, that when people become aware of what we're talking about today in these Superfund sites, that's going to affect real estate. And people that have bought homes, you mentioned before, $1 million homes, and they think they have this asset, and then later on find out that, they're right over top all these chemicals. I could see how that's going to cause a lot of problems.
Yes, and that's why wrongdoers should be held accountable. And they should be held accountable. And the falls in real estate prices are nothing compared to cancer in a child.
Okay, so you mentioned the fact that dry cleaners are still using. Is it just PC at this point, or both TC?
I'm a neurologist, not a dry cleaning expert. My understanding is that, well, for those who like to listen, so dry cleaning was started in like the 1880s, 1890s, and we used things like kerosene, which had this unfortunate property of being flammable, not too great. So in the 1930s, trichloroethylene was developed. So trichloroethylene's been around for about 100 years. It's known to cause cancer. That means it's been causing cancer for 100 years, approximately, in the United States. And then in the 1950s, it was supplanted by perchloroethylene, which is still a widely used dry cleaning agent, actually both in the United States and apparently in Europe.
Okay, just to be clear then, is TC being used in the US at this point?
I don't think not for dry cleaning, to my knowledge. Again, I can be wrong. I'm a neurologist. But it is used in other things. Its big uses at degreasing, especially metal, is its among its most common uses. But I told you it's been used in embalming. It's been used to decaffeinate coffee. It was used as an anesthetic agent in the 1950s and 1960s. Women could self-administer the anesthetic in a canister, and then they lose consciousness, and then they drop the canister. So, yeah.
And we want to also point out that you mentioned switching your dry cleaner to one of these non-chemical ones, which is a great step. But for people that live by a dry cleaner, they, in my mind, need to treat that as a Superfund site, a mini Superfund site. If you have one across the street from your home, you're in proximity to what sounds like the PCE.
Yeah, so they did a study looking, I think New York State Department of Health or New York Department of Environmental Conservation looked at homes, I think in the 1990s in New York City and in Albany that were located above dry cleaners. So many people who live in high rises, it used to be that there was a dry cleaner at the bottom of the high rise because you drop off your dry cleaning on your way to work, for example, and pick it up when you're coming home. And they found that 24 or 29 apartments in New York that were located above a dry cleaner had unsafe levels of the chemical perchloroethylene in their indoor air. And because the chemical is fat-loving, they found it in the butter and in the cheese in the refrigerator in those apartments. Similar studies have been done in Germany where they found the dry cleaning chemicals in the dairy products in grocery stores near dry cleaners, and now there are really strict regulations and not a ban on proximity of dry cleaners to grocery stores. One of my colleagues, Elmer Diaz, one of these great public servants, works for the Department of Health in Washington State, and he identified, I think, 80 child daycare centers that were located near dry cleaners in Washington State, and he's taking action to ensure that those children and those daycare centers are not exposed to this cancer-causing chemical or this likely carcinogen in the case of perchloroethylene in Washington State.
A lot to think about then. Daycare, schools, places of work, grocery stores that are near dry cleaners. You might not even live near the grocery store, but you're stopping there and getting your butter or your milk, and the chemicals can be in there. Your home, if you're in an apartment, you might be above one of these. So not to scare people, but just to turn people on to the different areas they need to be thinking about to protect you and your family.
Yeah, you're scaring me. But our book's really about message is around hope. And that means that diseases have causes. We figure out what these causes are. You take action to prevent your children, your grandchildren, your family members from getting affected by these terrible diseases. And it's not just Parkinson's disease. I told you about the link to cancer. Trifluoroethylene's been linked to congenital heart disease. It's been linked to miscarriages. It's been linked to autoimmune diseases. And that's just one of these chemicals. We haven't even talked about pesticides and the chemicals, the diseases that they're linked to. But I think there's just a general increasing awareness and awakening, if you will, in the public that these diseases have causes, and that one of the underlying causes for these things are chemicals in our environment. For people with Parkinson's, only about 13% of people with Parkinson's carry a genetic cause or genetic risk factor for the disease. Only 13%. That means 87% of Americans with Parkinson's have no known genetic cause or genetic risk factor for disease. The principal causes of many of these brain diseases are not inside of us. They're not in our DNA. They're not in our cells. They're in our environment. If we want to create a world where people live long, healthy lives free of these neurological disorders, I want to create a world where we're not spending hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars on Alzheimer's disease, tens of billions of dollars on Parkinson's disease, billions of dollars on ALS. We can do that by stopping use of these chemicals that are linked to these diseases.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
This problem is all around us, but almost no one's paying attention to it. And we're all paying a really, really high cost for this in terms of cancer and likely Parkinson's disease. Only about 13% of people with Parkinson's